British, November 24, 1944, 32,000 feet above Tokyo. Captain Hiroshi Matsumoto pushed his Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter into a near-vertical climb, engine screaming in protest, his oxygen mask frosting over as the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. He had intercepted American bombers dozens of times over the past 2 years, lumbering B-29s, vulnerable B-24s, aircraft that Japanese fighters could tear apart with coordinated attacks. What he was chasing now, through the thin air above Japan's capital, would shatter every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had made about American bomber capabilities. The massive silver aircraft above him, designated B-29 Superfortress, continued climbing effortlessly beyond his maximum ceiling. His engine sputtered, starved for oxygen, his controls went sluggish, and the American bomber simply disappeared into the stratosphere, untouchable, unreachable, impossible. For Captain Matsumoto and the 2,847 Japanese fighter pilots who engaged B-29 Superfortresses between November 1944 and August 1945, the collision between training and reality began the moment they pulled back their control sticks and discovered empty sky where their targets should have been. Among them were 156 ace pilots, men with 5 or more confirmed kills, Japan's best aviators, whose combat experience would prove utterly inadequate against an aircraft that operated in an entirely different dimension of aerial warfare. According to declassified records from the Japanese Defense Agency archives, preserved in the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, Japanese military intelligence had received reports about a new super bomber as early as September 1943. Strategic analysis documents, translated and catalogued as NIDS Report J2847, predicted the aircraft would have marginally improved range and payload compared to existing American heavy bombers. What actually appeared over Japan caught everyone catastrophically unprepared. Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Watanabe, commanding officer of the 244th Fighter Regiment stationed at Chofu Airfield outside Tokyo, recorded in his operational diary, now housed at the National Diet Library, his first encounter with B-29s on November 24, 1944. Scrambled 18 fighters at 13:47 hours to intercept formation of approximately 60 American bombers approaching from the southeast at estimated altitude of 25,000 feet, standard intercept procedure. By 14:10 hours, all 18 aircraft had made climbing attacks. 0 successful interceptions. The American bombers were operating at altitudes our fighters simply cannot reach with any combat effectiveness. Watched helplessly as they bombed the Nakajima aircraft plant from 32,000 feet. This is not an incremental improvement in enemy capability. This represents a fundamental shift in the strategic situation. The psychological preparation Japanese pilots received during training painted a specific picture of American aviation. Training documents from the Aquino Army Flying School, captured by Allied forces in 1945 and archived in the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, included detailed assessments of American bomber vulnerabilities. According to these documents, American heavy bombers were heavily armed but slow and unmaneuverable, vulnerable to coordinated fighter attacks from multiple angles, especially effective when attacked from directly ahead or below. Pilots were taught that Japanese fighters, lighter, more maneuverable, with experienced pilots following Bushido principles, held decisive tactical advantages in any engagement. The training manual, designated Tactical Employment Against Heavy Bombers, Edition 7, dedicated 43 pages to specific attack patterns that had proven effective against B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators in the Pacific Theater. Section 12 of the manual confidently stated, American bomber formations rely on mutual defensive fire for protection. Individual bombers, when separated from formation, become vulnerable targets. Priority should be given to damaging lead aircraft to disrupt formation cohesion, then systematically eliminating isolated bombers. The A6M Zero, Japan's primary fighter aircraft since 1940, had been designed with different priorities than American fighters. Where American aircraft emphasized durability, firepower, and speed, the Zero prioritized range, maneuverability, and rate of climb. It could reach a maximum altitude of approximately 33,000 feet under ideal conditions. Unloaded, with a light pilot, perfect weather, and a freshly tuned engine. But reaching an altitude and fighting effectively at that altitude were entirely different propositions. Above 28,000 feet, the Zero's controls became sluggish. Its rate of climb dropped from 3,000 feet per minute at sea level to barely 500 feet per minute at operational ceiling, and its maneuverability, the aircraft's primary advantage, essentially disappeared. The thin air at extreme altitude meant control surfaces responded slowly, turns required enormous amounts of sky, and the aircraft handled like a truck rather than the nimble fighter pilots had trained on.
British. Yet here flew Captain Matsumoto, age 31, formerly an instructor pilot at Aquino with 847 flight hours and 12 confirmed victories against American aircraft, watching American bombers drop their ordnance on Tokyo with the precision of a training exercise, while his fighter wallowed helplessly 3,000 feet below, unable to close the gap. The cognitive dissonance wasn't merely frustrating, it was architecturally devastating to everything Japanese military aviation doctrine had promised. First Lieutenant Kenji Yoshida scrambled from Narimasu Airfield on the western outskirts of Tokyo during the same November 24th raid, described his experience in a combat report later discovered in captured Japanese military records at the Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Initiated climbing attack at 14:05 hours, achieved maximum altitude of 29,500 feet after 8 minutes of full-power climb. American formation was clearly visible above us, silver aircraft gleaming in afternoon sun, completely undisturbed by our presence. Attempted to close distance, engine began missing at 14:12 hours, oil temperature critical, cylinder head temperature exceeded safe limits, controls barely responsive, needed both hands on stick to execute even gentle turns. I was not fighting the Americans, I was fighting physics itself. Broke off attack at 14:18 hours, having fired not a single round. Watched the Americans complete their bombing run and depart toward the east. We were as helpless as children watching adults work. The revelation of American technological superiority came in layers, each more psychologically devastating than the last. According to operational records from the 5th Air Army headquarters in Tokyo, preserved in the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, the first month of B-29 operations over Japan revealed the catastrophic gap between Japanese capabilities and American engineering. Major Ryosuke Nomura, senior intelligence officer at 5th Air Army Headquarters, maintained detailed analysis reports that were captured by occupation forces in September 1945 and later donated to the National Air and Space Museum archives in Washington, D.C. His assessment from December 15, 1944 reads, "After 3 weeks of B-29 operations over the home islands, we must accept several devastating conclusions. First, our fighters cannot effectively intercept these aircraft at their operational altitude. The ceiling advantage alone renders conventional interception tactics obsolete. Second, even when our most skilled pilots manage to reach attack position, a rare occurrence requiring perfect conditions, the B-29's speed at altitude, approximately 350 miles per hour, makes sustained attack nearly impossible with our current fighter performance. Third, the aircraft's defensive armament, remote-controlled turrets with computing gun sights, create overlapping fields of fire that make traditional attack angles suicidal. Fourth, the bomber's operational range allows it to strike any target in Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands, 1,500 miles away. We have no comparable capability and no means of striking their bases. Fifth, American production appears capable of sustaining these operations indefinitely, while our own aircraft production declines monthly. The technical specifications told their own devastating story. The B-29 Superfortress was powered by 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower or 8,800 horsepower total, more than 4 times the power of a Zero fighter. The aircraft could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over a range of 3,250 miles or 12,000 pounds over 4,100 miles. Its maximum speed at altitude exceeded 350 miles per hour. Its pressurized cabin allowed the 11-man crew to operate comfortably at altitudes where Japanese pilots were barely conscious, gasping into primitive oxygen masks in unpressurized cockpits. Most devastating of all, the United States was producing these technological marvels at a rate of nearly 350 aircraft per month by late 1944. Japan's entire fighter production for all types combined averaged 1,200 aircraft monthly and declining as American bombing damaged factories and raw material shortages intensified. Japanese intelligence had obtained detailed technical data on the B-29 through multiple sources by early 1945. According to analysis prepared by the Technical Air Arsenal at Tachikawa, a research facility west of Tokyo, now archived in the Science Museum in Ueno, Japanese engineers studied every scrap of information available: reconnaissance photographs taken by high-altitude cameras, captured technical documents from downed B-29s in China, debris recovered from crashed aircraft, metallurgical analysis of recovered fragments, even measurements taken by ground observers using surveying equipment to track the aircraft's contrails and calculate altitude, speed, and formation spacing. Their conclusion, documented in Technical Report TA-445, dated January 30, 1945, makes for sobering reading. The B-29 represents not an evolutionary improvement over existing American heavy bombers, but a revolutionary leap in aircraft design and execution. The United States has solved fundamental engineering problems: high-altitude pressurization systems, turbocharged engines maintaining power output at extreme altitude, remote fire control using analog computing, long-range navigation systems, structural engineering allowing unprecedentedly high wing loading that our own aviation industry has not even attempted to address. The industrial capacity, machine tool sophistication, and material science required to produce such aircraft in large numbers exceeds Japan's total aviation manufacturing capability by an estimated factor of 15 to 1. We lack not merely the specific technologies, but the industrial ecosystem necessary to develop them.
But technical specifications and intelligence reports, no matter how detailed, couldn't capture the visceral, gut-level impact of watching these silver giants fly overhead in perfect formation, completely untouchable, bombing Japanese cities with the casual precision of a training exercise. The psychological effect on Japanese fighter pilots, men who had trained for years, who had survived brutal combat, who considered themselves among the empire's elite warriors, was profound and demoralizing. Sergeant Takeshi Nakamura, a maintenance crew chief at Chofu Airfield responsible for keeping the 244th Fighter Regiment's Zeros combat-ready, kept an unofficial diary that was discovered by his family decades after the war and donated to the Yasukuni War Memorial Museum in 1987. His entry from December 3, 1944, reveals the atmosphere among frontline aviation units. The pilots no longer speak confidently about intercepting the American superbombers. The cocky swagger that characterized our squadron 3 months ago has vanished.
Today, Lieutenant Saito returned from his third consecutive attempt to reach a B-29 formation. His Zero's engine was severely damaged from excessive strain during the extended full-power climb. Piston rings shot, bearings scored, cylinder head warped from overheating. The engine is a total loss, and replacement engines grow scarcer by the week. When the mechanics asked what happened in the air, he simply stared at the ground and said, "We are fighting an enemy we cannot reach. What is the point?" Several pilots have quietly requested transfers to special attack units. They reasoned that if they cannot fight effectively as fighters, they might at least die meaningfully as human bombs. This is the first time I have seen experienced fighter pilots, men who genuinely loved flying, who volunteered for aviation duty, actively seeking death missions. The B-29 has broken something fundamental in their spirits. The Special Attack Corps reference, euphemistically called kamikaze in the West, wasn't metaphorical rhetoric. According to personnel transfer records from Imperial Japanese Army Air Service Headquarters, compiled in Rikihei Inoguchi's 1958 historical study, The Divine Wind, and cross-referenced with official casualty records maintained at the Ministry of Health and Welfare, 37 experienced fighter pilots with an average of 680 flight hours and 4.3 confirmed victories each transferred from conventional interceptor squadrons to suicide attack units between December 1944 and March 1945. Their transfer requests specifically cited inability to effectively engage B-29 formations and desire to serve the Emperor meaningfully as primary motivations. These weren't desperate recruits or fanatical volunteers. These were skilled aviators, men who represented years of training investment, transferring to certain death because they saw no other way to affect the strategic situation. The altitude advantage was merely the most visible, most immediately obvious manifestation of American technological superiority. Beneath that single overwhelming advantage lay a cascade of secondary and tertiary technological gaps that made the B-29 nearly invulnerable to Japanese defenses even when fighters somehow managed to reach attack position. The aircraft's remote-controlled gun turret system represented a quantum leap beyond anything in Japanese bomber defensive systems. 4 turrets, top forward, top aft, bottom forward, bottom aft, mounting a total of 10 Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. But the revolutionary aspect wasn't the guns themselves. It was the fire control system. Each gunner sat at a station with a computing gun sight that automatically calculated lead angles based on target range, speed, and angle of approach. When a gunner acquired a target, the analog computer, a mechanical marvel of gears, cams, and gyroscopes, instantly calculated the necessary deflection and directed not just the gunner's own turret, but potentially multiple turrets to engage the threat. The system created overlapping fields of fire that covered virtually every approach angle simultaneously. Traditional Japanese fighter tactics, developed through 3 years of combat against Allied bombers in China and the Pacific, relied on identifying blind spots in bombers' defensive coverage and exploiting those vulnerabilities through coordinated attacks. Zeros would approach from angles where few guns could bear, directly ahead and slightly below, or from high 6 o'clock angles that most tail gunners couldn't effectively cover. The B-29 had no such exploitable blind spots. Captain Saburo Sakai, Japan's third highest-scoring ace with 64 confirmed victories and arguably the most experienced surviving fighter pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy, attempted his first B-29 intercept on November 27, 1944, flying from Yokosuka Naval Air Station. His account, recorded in his 1957 memoir, Samurai, and verified against official combat records maintained at the National Institute for Defense Studies, captures the shock of encountering the bomber's defensive capabilities for the first time. I had attacked hundreds of enemy aircraft over 3 years of combat. American Wildcats and Coursers, British Hurricanes, Dutch Brewsters, Chinese-flown Russian fighters, every variant of American bomber from B-17s to B-24s to B-25s. I understood bomber defensive tactics intimately. I had studied American gun turret coverage patterns. I knew where bombers were vulnerable, or so I absolutely believed.
Before I could even open fire, before I had closed to effective range, multiple turrets on not just my target, but on adjacent aircraft in the formation swiveled toward me with unnatural mechanical speed. The computing gunsight system had detected my approach, calculated my speed and angle of attack, and directed coordinated defensive fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. Tracer rounds, dozens of streams, filled the air around my aircraft like a luminous spiderweb. I felt multiple impacts on my wing and fuselage, instrument panels shattered, control cables severed. Broke off immediately in a desperate dive, pulling negative Gs that nearly made me black out. Limped back to Yokosuka with an aircraft that should have crashed. I had not even scratched the bomber's paint. In 3 years of combat, I had never encountered anything like this defensive system. We weren't fighting pilots. We were fighting machines that calculated faster and aimed more accurately than any human gunner possibly could. The Air Technical Arsenal at Tachikawa conducted extensive analysis of B-29 combat engagements throughout December 1944 and January 1945, attempting to identify tactical vulnerabilities that Japanese fighters might exploit. They interviewed every pilot who survived an engagement with the bombers, analyzed gun camera footage from the few aircraft equipped with cameras, studied debris patterns from the handful of B-29s that had been shot down, and even conducted tests with captured .50 caliber machine guns to understand their effective range and penetration capability. Their report from February 12, 1945, preserved in the National Institute for Defense Studies archives, makes for grim reading. Effective attack against B-29 formations requires simultaneous, coordinated strikes from multiple angles by at least 6 fighters to saturate the defensive fire control system's tracking capacity. However, achieving such precise coordination at operational altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, with existing radio communication equipment suffering from extreme range limitations and atmospheric interference, while simultaneously dealing with American P-51 escort fighters that now accompany many raids, is operationally impractical given current pilot skill levels and aircraft performance limitations. Recommendation: shift primary anti-B-29 defensive efforts from fighter interception to ground-based anti-aircraft artillery, particularly high-altitude capable 120mm guns. Fighter resources should be conserved for lower-altitude tactical situations where Japanese aircraft retain performance advantages. But even this recommendation proved futile. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery had been designed and deployed throughout the war to engage aircraft at altitudes up to approximately 25,000 feet, adequate for early war bombers, but hopelessly inadequate for B-29 operations. The 75mm and 88mm guns that form the backbone of Japanese air defense could theoretically reach 30,000 feet, but at extreme altitude their shells lost velocity and accuracy, producing a dispersed, ineffective barrage that B-29 formations navigated with minimal concern. According to loss statistics compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war and cross-referenced with Japanese air defense expenditure records, anti-aircraft artillery fire accounted for only 11.7% of B-29 combat losses over Japan throughout the entire campaign, a remarkably, almost unbelievably low attrition rate compared to the 35 to 40% loss rates that American bombers experienced from German flak over Europe. The growing realization wasn't limited to combat pilots experiencing repeated tactical defeats. Throughout Japan's air defense network, from radar operators tracking formations they couldn't intercept, to air raid wardens watching helpless as bombs fell, to military planners reviewing mounting damage reports, the same devastating truth was becoming undeniable. Japanese air defenses, built around assumptions of rough tactical parity with enemy aircraft, were fundamentally, catastrophically obsolete. First Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, a radar operator at the Matsudo Early Warning Station 40 kilometers east of Tokyo, witnessed the psychological impact on ground personnel who watched this slow-motion strategic catastrophe unfold on their radar scopes day after day. In a 1982 interview conducted for the National Museum of Japanese History's Oral History Preservation Project, she recalled, "We would detect the B-29 formations approaching from 200 kilometers away. Massive formations, sometimes exceeding 100 aircraft, flying in perfect geometric patterns at altitudes our equipment could barely track. We would immediately alert Fighter Command. Fighters would scramble from multiple airfields, Chofu, Naramasu, Fusa, sometimes 18 or 20 aircraft total. We would track both the Americans and our own fighters on radar screens. Time after time, we watched the same tragic pattern. Our fighters would climb toward the American formations, the altitude differential on our screens would slowly close, then, inevitably, our fighters would level off thousands of feet below the Americans. The gap would stabilize. The Americans would continue serenely to their targets, bomb with methodical precision, and depart eastward over the Pacific. Our fighters would orbit uselessly for a few minutes, then return to base, having accomplished absolutely nothing." After 2 months of this, by late January 1945, Fighter Command essentially stopped scrambling interceptors during daytime B-29 raids. They were wasting irreplaceable aviation fuel and accumulating engine hours that brought aircraft closer to maintenance requirements we increasingly couldn't meet, all for literally zero results. We simply watched on radar as American bombers destroyed our cities, methodically, repeatedly, while we did nothing. Because we could do nothing.
British. The fuel consideration wasn't merely an operational inconvenience, it represented another dimension of the growing catastrophe. By early 1945, Japan faced critical petroleum shortages as American submarines strangled the sea lanes connecting the home islands to oil sources in the Dutch East Indies. According to petroleum supply records maintained by the Ministry of Munitions and archived in the Economic and Scientific Section records at the National Diet Library, Japan's aviation fuel stocks had dropped to barely 30% of 1944 levels by March 1945, forcing draconian fuel rationing across all military aviation units. Every sortie against B-29s consumed precious fuel. Every flight hour accumulated on engines brought them closer to mandatory overhauls that increasingly couldn't be performed due to parts shortages and damaged manufacturing facilities. The brutal calculus became inescapable. Japan was spending scarce resources on fighter operations that achieved nothing, while the strategic situation deteriorated daily. Captain Matsumoto, whose desperate chase into the stratosphere opened the story, flew his last attempted B-29 interception on December 19, 1944. His aircraft, the same Zero that had failed him on November 24, now showed nearly 400 flight hours since its last major overhaul, well beyond recommended maintenance intervals. The engine ran rough. Oil consumption had increased to unsustainable levels. Control surfaces showed wear that should have grounded the aircraft. He climbed to 28,000 feet that day, the absolute maximum his degraded aircraft could manage. The B-29 formation flew serenely at 32,000 feet, utterly unreachable. He didn't even attempt an attack. He simply flew alongside and below the American formation for 11 minutes, watching them bomb the Mitsubishi engine plant at Nagoya, watching the impossibly large aircraft maintain perfect formation, watching contrails stream from their wings as they turned eastward toward the Pacific and safety. In his personal diary, recovered after the war by occupation authorities and now archived at the National Diet Library, he wrote that evening, "I am a fighter pilot who cannot reach the enemy. My aircraft cannot climb high enough. My guns cannot penetrate their armor at the few angles I might attack from. My tactics are obsolete. My training is irrelevant.
I have become a spectator to Japan's destruction, watching from below as American bombers erase our industrial capacity piece by piece. If this is what American engineering can accomplish, what have we been fighting for? What did our leaders promise us that bears any relationship to reality? The revelation had occurred. The impossible had become undeniable. Japanese pilots, elite warriors, skilled aviators, men who had sacrificed everything for the emperor and the homeland, had discovered they were fighting an enemy operating in a different technological era entirely. But this was merely the beginning. The material reality of American bomber superiority was obvious, unavoidable, measured in burnt factories and rising casualties. The deeper revelation, what this disparity revealed about American industrial capacity, about the lies Japanese propaganda had told, about the fundamental strategic impossibility of victory, had yet to fully manifest. That reckoning was coming. And when it arrived, these pilots would face questions far more devastating than tactical defeat. How could their leaders have sent them to fight a war they could never win? What else had they been lied to about? And what would happen when the truth became impossible to deny? The Silver Bombers continued their relentless campaign, unreachable in the stratosphere, systematically dismantling Japan's ability to wage war. Below them, Japanese pilots watched helplessly, their confidence shattered, their worldview crumbling, carrying knowledge more dangerous than any bomb, the knowledge that everything they'd been told was a lie.